YouTube? Scrag 101 here, trying to get this video out. Had a couple issues with the camera, memory, things like that. Battery died. Hopefully I can make it through this time. I've gotten a couple of personal messages questioning whether the 0 to 1 restriction on units and 1+ restrictions, things like that, and other limitations have actually been removed, and how I justify this, how I came to the conclusion. Some people are like, hey, thanks for pointing this out. I didn't notice this before. Some people are like, you're an idiot, read the rules, it's clearly printed still, blah, blah, blah. So I'm going to do, hopefully, a quick explanation of how you come about this, and if you disagree, post why you disagree. Please back it up with some kind of fact, not just feelings and beliefs still based in older editions, 6th, 7th edition. The way that you come about this is, for example, Ogre Kingdoms. Ogre Kingdoms used to have a 0 to 1 restriction on tyrants. And no matter how many points army you spent or were playing, you could only have one tyrant. This is an old rule, no longer in effect. Why? Well, when you read the Warhammer rulebook and you get to page 134 and 135, it specifically says in the side column up at the top right, there's a small little paragraph that when this book was written, there were older edition army books that had a different selection system than the one presented here on page 134 and 135. And in a one-off instance where the basic rulebook overrides the individual Warhammer Armies books, you are to use the selection system presented here in the basic rulebook over any selection system, keyword there is any selection system, presented in your army book. Okay? So that right there should be your first key that things have changed. So people will say, okay, well, what they mean by that is just you're not going to be picking, 2 rares and 3 specials and things like that. You're right. That's gone too. More specifically, 0 to 1s and 1+s and any other unit restrictions are gone as well. Why is that? Well, the first hint, again, happens here in that they specifically say that the Army Selection Summary Table breaks it down for you. It says Lords, you can have up to 25% of your army be Lords with no duplicate limits. That means 2 tyrants or more. Heroes, up to 25%, no limits. Okay? As many butchers as you want. Core, at least 25% of your army must be core, no limits. That would be things like Noblar Trappers. They used to have a limit that you had to have a unit of bulls for every unit of Noblar Trappers. Specials, up to 50% of your army could be special. This is where they start adding limits, though. You can have a limit of 3 duplicate choices. So, and say Ogre's army, where before I could only have a scrap launcher if I took a unit of Noblars, I could only have a unit of Noblars if I took a unit of bulls. Now there's no limit, except for duplicates. That's the only limit. I can have 3 scrap launchers now. I don't have to have bulls, and I don't have to have Noblars to take them. I'll explain this in just a second. Rares, up to 2 duplicates. Okay, Man-Eaters, Gorgers, Slave Giants, or any other rares that are out there. My only limitation for taking them is duplicates and percentage. I can't spend more than 25% of my points on my rare units, and I can't have more than 2 of the same rare unit. Well, Scrag, you're wrong, because in the Ogre Kingdoms book, that's not a selection thing, that's a unit entry thing. Okay? You're right, it is a unit entry thing. But if you go to GW's website and you download the current errata that's there and the current fact, frequently asked questions that are there, one of the very first things they say is on page 66 and 67 of the Ogre Kingdoms book, and this is true for every other book out there. I've looked, every one of them has done the same thing. So if you have an army book that's old, like Bretonians or what else, that had 0 to 1, 1+ restrictions, things like that, or any other limitations, this specifically is true to you as well. And you can do the exact same thing I'm about to do with Ogres. It says on the errata, the army list entry, okay, so that's everything here and here on page 66 and 67. Ignore these pages and use the rules for choosing an army in the Warhammer rulebook. Okay, so if I ignore all these pages, then I'm ignoring the rules for 0 to 1 and 1 plus and yada yada other limitations. Well, Scrag, you're still wrong, because it doesn't say anywhere on the errata to ignore the unit entry right here that says 0 to 1. Well, yes and no. It doesn't say in the errata to ignore the 0 to 1 tyrant that is printed here on the book on page 68. However, the entry in the errata does say to ignore everything on page 66 and 67. So if I continue reading a little bit further, I'll see that, okay, not only are the rules for what 0 to 1 and 1 plus means, so if I ignore just that first paragraph, I wouldn't know what 0 to 1 and 1 plus mean, so I don't know why it's in front of my tyrant. But to continue on, the very next paragraph says unit entries. This is the part where people are sticking. Each unit is represented by an entry in the army list. The unit's name is given and any limitations that apply are explained. Okay, so 0 to 1 tyrant. That would be the unit entry that lists the name of the unit and the limitation. The limitation is not explained anymore, and the entry is to be ignored. The only thing here that you go by is the fact that it's your lord and a tyrant. Technically, you don't even call him a tyrant anymore. You call him Billy Bob or something like that. He's whatever you want him to be, but he's one of your lord characters. And you ignore the whole entire entry of the limitation, the 0 to 1. This applies not only to the tyrant, but to the bulls. 1 plus bulls have to be fielded because ogres are a nation full of bulls and they go to every fight. Yada yada. There's fluff all the way out the door with that one. I don't care. I'm talking about actual physical rules. Not fluff, not feelings, not happy thoughts, anything like that. Just the actual new rules for selecting an army. So if I'm ignoring the unit entry that gives me a limitation that I have to have 1 unit of bulls in every army, then I don't have to field a unit of bulls. But wait, if you don't field a unit of bulls, then you can't take Noblar fighters, and then you can't take a scrap puncher. Well, again, you ignore the entire unit entry. The only things you don't ignore in the unit entry, okay, so people would say, well, then I ignore the movement, weapon skill, and strength and initiative, toughness. No, you don't. Well, why not? You're ignoring the other stuff. Well, all that stuff is listed as a profile. Profiles are covered in the basic rulebook. So this is just a reference to the profile for that unit, and it still exists because it wasn't errated out of here. It still exists. So you can still use it. It's still there. You're not ignoring it. You're simply ignoring what was written on page 67. So page 67 says to ignore it, but it's still written somewhere else, so it isn't ignored. If that makes sense to you, good. If it doesn't, there's other help you need.